And okay, well, there's not many of you. I guess there's maybe some coursework due or something. And yeah, it is. Okay. But anyway, we have to move on, and at least you might be able to catch up a little bit later, as this is not due to next coursework is not still have a little bit of time to come. And so last week we talked about Node.js, which is the server we're going to use for the next coursework, and this time we're going to talk about something called Express, and it's usually known as a middleware. You runs on the server. So we didn't use this in last year. Last year, say you have a server which correctly talks directly to a database, has nothing in between. So this is somewhere in between the server and the database. Okay, and just to explain where the Express sits, and so we have the front end, which is the view, which the back end will be MongoDB. We're going to talk a bit more next week. And this is in the middle, so the front end always talks to the server. It's rarely talks to the MongoDB directly. On the server, they set something called Express, or middleware in general, which handles all the user requests, for example, login or retrieve some data, or update their report. That's where the Express sits. Okay, and so what the Express does, it will do these things, make your life a little bit easier. So you can actually do, excuse me, all the work that Express does yourself, writing your Node.js code, similar to what we see last week. But Express makes the life to be easier. So for example, it will pass the HTTP request. For example, in the request, you might put in some information saying, and I want to retrieve the record of this user. So you're putting, say, retrieve user ID equal to something, something. And you can get that information, say, user ID and value out of the actual request and using express.js, which makes it a bit easy and allows you to manage web sessions, but we will probably not going to have time to. And you can do organizing routes, and which is going to explain what routes are and how that work. And so just intuitively, a route, for example, if you want to retrieve all the data, there will be one route. And if you want to delete a record, there will be another route. And you want to update a user, there will be a third route. So these are different routes. Okay, this one, and give you an example, say, if you don't use Express and you write all these code in Node.js, it's possible, and what it might look like. And here, we're talking about two endpoints, or these the same thing as route. So obviously, I'm going to not fully explain what these things are because we're going to do many of those later on, use slightly different ways. And so in terms of code, and this part, we covered the last week, and these are the different modules or libraries or packages that you need to do. And maybe the only thing additional is this one here. So this one gets you the MongoDB driver, so you can talk to the database. And so the next part up to here would say basically all of this is connected to MongoDB, which we'll cover actually in the next lecture. So next part, these code are actually creating the so-called route. Okay, so first you have to creating a HTTP server. That's what we already did last week. And at that time, the server can only just respond to one fixed message, say welcome. That's all. But in this case, it started to do the same. For example, it want to first test if the request method is equal to get, and that's the pass, and you can do something, etc., etc. And then say if the request dot method is equal to post, and then the pass equal to this, and you do something else. So in this case, because it's a post, that probably means you want to create something. This is more. Okay, and then later on we'll see, say, to do the similar things, you need to write much less code using Express, and also easier to manage. Okay, and so for example, these are the things without Express you have to do manually. For example, you have to pass URLs to extractors to say which part is about user ID and what that actually ID is yourself. And also, for example, here we haven't actually using any specific input yet. Or we just look at this, say, check the different message, the request type, whether it's a GET or is it a POST. Okay. So how do you actually use it? So firstly, the code, the Express code, you will put in a JavaScript code. Just you would put in a Node.js code. So these codes usually is named as, say, server.js, or sometimes called app.js or index.js. It doesn't really matter so long as it's a .js file. And these are the common names. And inside you will write a node.js command, like require something, and starting a server, etc. Okay. And what you do would be usually including third-party dependencies. So obviously you have to first including the package for the module for Express, so you can use it. And you might want to use other things like HTTP or other utility modules from the node. And you need to configure the express.js settings, and which we don't really need to do much because we're not doing any rendering. And on the server side, which I'll explain in a second. And then you also want to connect to the database, which we're going to cover next week. How do we connect to MongoDB? Okay, and most of the work will be in this step, step 4, and is to define middleware. And step 5, define routers. So that basically defines when you get a response from the client or request from the client, depends on what the request is, how do you respond. So sometimes this request is to retrieve everything, then it will retrieve everything. But also, you probably would say, make sure the user is logged in and authorized to retrieve data before you do the retrieving. And these what are the middlewares and the routers do. We're going to see more examples later on. And finally, start the app. So usually that just means start the server. Okay, and all this thing says is, and in your code, and you are more likely to have more than one middleware or routes. And the orders they are wrote and in the code is very important. So basically, the one in front will get run first, and they have precedence over the later ones. So for example, the first route that meets the request criteria and will get run, and it might just terminate the whole response and send a response and terminate the whole cycle. So everything after that might not run at all. So the order is important. Okay, that's the most important message there. Okay, and then, so to use that, and you have to first install Express. So it does not come with a node. So last week we showed you can install Node, and on your computer you just download and install, or use on Mac or slightly different. And then for install Express itself, it's just a module. And once you once you have that installed, you have two ways to create an Express app. One way is the so-called an Express generator. So this is something like a command line. You type that command and in the command window, it will create some files and folders for you. Okay, and so we didn't quite cover, but say for the Vue.js, you can actually have Vue.js CLI as well, stands for command line tools, and if you run that, and it will generate files and folder for you. Okay, and the other way would be just say use Express and the module in your code, and you just say require Express in your code, and this will be the one that we're going to using for our examples and coursework. Okay, and before we go on further to talk about, okay, how do you exactly install the Express module and how do you require that, we're going to talk the important concept about the client-side rendering, which is short for CSR, and server-side rendering. Okay, so the first thing is that rendering means creating the web pages. That's what rendering means. So you have your code, for example, and essentially, and how do I say, this code could be in JavaScript, could be in PHP, and then when you mix that with the data from the backend and creating the actual HTML file, that's what the rendering means. So there's two places that you can do the rendering, as the name says. So one is on the client, which is in the browser that users see. The other one is on the server, for example, in this case, where the Node.js sits. So the way it works is like this. So it's always the user first send a request, say, I want to open this page. Say this will be the home page for my app. And in the middleware, the Express will handle their server. For example, if it's open the first page, it will send a request to the database if it needs any database data from the database. And then the database will return any required data. And in most cases, these will be in JSON format. So up to this step, so request, the route processing, and the results. When it's up to here, it's completely the same for client or server-side rendering. It's always the same. The difference is only after you receive the data back from the database. Okay, so on the server-side rendering, and an HTML page will be created on the server, then the HTML file will be sent back to the front end. So basically, the front end will receive an entire HTML code with, say, all the elements, all the formatting, and all the data already put in there. I think this might be closer to what you did in the second year, when you get the data back. You use PHP to generate all the HTML code and then send it to the client. Okay, and in our case, and it's a little bit different, we are doing client-side rendering, in the sense, on your browser or the client side, you have this Vue code which creates all the templates, which will generate the page or the part of the page for you once it has the data fitting. So once the server receives the results, it passes this JSON directly back to the client. So the client receives a JSON data, not an HTML code. And then these code on the front end, which is essentially the Vue code, will try to create an HTML page from the data it receives. So you program the template that Vue going to create. That's called client-side rendering, because the HTML code is generated on the client side. Yeah. So for this module, we're going to do client-side rendering. So all the server going to return is different JSON files. The server is not going to return any HTML pages. Okay. Now we can see how do we create the simplest Express server. So first, obviously, you have to create a node project, and then you need to install the express.js, which is an extra module you have to install. It doesn't come with Node.js, and you have to import that in your code. And you might need to set up a server. That's not optional. That's optional. And you write your code in some file. In this case, let's call it server.js. And finally, you run the app. Okay. As I said, we're not gonna using the Express generator to create all the files and folders for us. We're going to do this manually. So the command to start a new node project is to type in node and init initialize. So you type this in a folder that you want to put in a Node.js project. And something similar to Git. So in Git, you type in git init to start a local repository. We can do this in an example. Okay, let me find a place to create a new folder for this. So this will be week 10. New folder. Yeah. Yeah, so you can see this one okay now. And so if I list all the files in my current folder, and it's currently nothing, and if I type in npm, so this will initialize an empty Node.js code for me, and it will ask you a few questions. Okay, so it first asks the package name. I'll just say demo. The things in the bracket is the default value. So the version will be 1, and some description. I will say, again, this is not okay. And then saying what will be the main file. I call it server.js. Okay. And then finally say yes. And it will create this file and this package.json file for you. That's the only thing it does. And it has these things in there, which is answers you provided for those questions. So if I list all the files now, you can see I only have this package and .json file. If I show the file content, it has these content. So basically, just set up an empty file, so empty Node.js project with these ones. Okay, so that's what this one does. And because this is a JSON file, you can actually open it in, say, Visual Studio Code. You can change these things. And you can change, say, the name, change the main file names, change the script, etc. later on. Okay, and the next step is to actually install the Express itself because we need it. And so the command to do that will be just say npm install Express. So the npm will try to find out where to download the Express and install it for you. And also, the shorthand to write this will be npm I. I is short for install and then Express.
Just for Windows too.
Yeah. npm, all the command here works for different operating systems because all these commands are specific to Node.js only, which works the same on different operating systems. So you would actually see after you do this in your package.json file, you had one extra line at the end that shows you now installed Express, and that's required for this project. So we can do this. We can say npm install Express, yeah, and this will go online. It has to be online, otherwise it will not be able to find file, do something. And it says added Express version 4.17.1. Okay, and this one says it added additional things. So these are the things that Express relies on. So Express relies other packages to run. So it will install all of these. And then now if you check your package.json file again, and you can see this extra line now there. The rest is still the same, doesn't change. It just says I now install. Then you can use it in your code. Yeah. Okay, and so this is just like a quick comment. So because once you've done npm install express, and all those files will be saved locally in the same directory. So if you see now, so we have actually this one now. This is actually a directory. It has lots of files in it. So basically, these are the files that needed to run or part of the express package. So if I do, let me see if I can do this. Okay, so if you look at this, these are all the things underneath or inside node modules. And if your project needs lots of these modules, and this directory can get quite big. So in a sense, these files are not needed if you want to save your code on GitHub, because these files can be easily downloaded from server if needed. The only part really important is the code you write, which is, in our case, we haven't written it yet, but in our case, for example, the server.js file that you're going to create later, which is way smaller. But only that part is important. So you can use git ignore setting, which is a file in Git, and you can exclude what you don't want to include in when you commit to a Git repository. So you can easily set it up to exclude, say, the Node.js node module directory and don't include anything in Git. I'll give you a link there and to how to do this. Then we'll cover that. So finally is, say, for example, if you committed your code and not including any actual node files for, say, Express or any other libraries you use, and when you check out from the GitLab and Git repository, you would not have these files in your checkout. Does that make sense? So if you don't including this node modules directory in your GitHub, so anyone check out that from the GitHub would not have this directory or any files underneath it, but you would still need them to run, because otherwise it will not run. So the way to do this, we'll just do npm install or npm I. So what it does, it will go look at the dependency part of the package.json file and automatically install everything which is listed there with the fixed version. So in this case, if you have this file but you don't have the node modules directory, and if you run npm, just npm install, it will install everything listed there for you. So that's how you get everything back. Okay. Yeah.
So look through the package and then install everything.
So basically, this line is install everything automatically without having to type it manually. So previously, you have to say type install npm express or second package or third package. Once they all added into the package.json dependency, because every time you install a new package, it will be added here. And if you have 10 packages, it will be all listed here. And when you run npm install, it will all install all those 10 packages for you automatically. Yeah. Okay. So now we're gonna see how do you create the simplest possible Express server, and which actually is not that different from the Node.js server we created last time. So the first line is you need to require. This is like an import library or module. So in JavaScript or Node.js, it's require. So the name is called Express, and you usually assign that to a variable so you can call different functions later on. And so, for example, then you say let app equal to Express. So essentially, this is run Express, creating an instance of Express server. Okay, and this is where you're creating the response. And so it says app.o. Okay, we're going to cover more in that later on. But say this app is this app defined here. So basically that is the express. And .all stands for all types of requests. I'm going to explain later on. For example, if you want to say have different response to get or put or delete request, and you can say get, put, or delete or post here. But in this case, I said for all the responses, and doesn't really matter what this file path is, I'm gonna run this. So you have these two variables. Okay, if you remember, this is one way to define anonymous functions without a name, the function without a name. These are two parameters, and this is the body. So this parameter stands for, anyone remember? Request, yeah. So that will including basically the URL people send you. If there's any extra information in the body, the request body, they'll be all in here. And this stands for response. So basically everything you want to send back, you use the response object. So that basically it says for the response, I'm gonna do send and with a message. So that's the function for the response. Essentially, every time you send any request, you will just get this text back. That's all it is. So that's the same as the Node.js server we did last time, and just we did a different message sent back. And this is part where you actually run the server. And you say app, which is again express.listen. So that means running the server. I'm going to be listening on port 3000. And this is going to be the function run when I start the server. Yeah, does that make sense? So that means these are the things you needed. And then you say, okay, all the response I'm going to send is just this text. And finally, you start the server. That's all. Okay, and if you need to run, this is the command. If you remember, to run any Node.js code, you type node first, followed by the file name that you want to run. And if we call this server.js, just type in node server.js and it will run. And then you can open up in your local host. It should give you this message. Yeah. So we can have a quick look. I'm not going to type the code again because it's going to take some time. It's a bit small. Okay. Okay. So yeah, hopefully you can read. So this is a directory. I'm gonna put all my code in there, and the first one I'm gonna create is called app.js. So not called server.js, but it doesn't really matter. And it has these things, as we just seen there, very similar. I had two extra actually constants are required, HTTP and path, and you can see actually a little bit grayed out because it's never used. So we can ignore these two lines. But then first I required express package, and then I define app as an instance of the request, and I set port, okay. And this part can be skipped as well because we set the port here later. And then this is the line where we decide how the responses are, and that's starting the server. So if I now, so to run this, so I just type in node, then followed by this file name. Oh, sorry. In this case, should be called app.js. Okay, maybe let me just clear this. Yeah, so that's how you run this file. Oops. Error. Yeah. Oh, okay. And this is okay. This is not the directory, correct directory. And so we're gonna be in week 10, and that will be in Express demo. Yeah. Yeah, so now this is the right place now. I can then type node. Okay, and then you can see it will say the node express server, express.js server is listening. That's essentially what message you typed in here. And if you go to your browser and you type in localhost, so it's 3000, which is the port. Okay. This is okay. One last time, yeah. So it sends back a message, and again, so that is a message we wrote here. Welcome to the expressions examples. That's all the responses you get.
Can a response be a 5?
Response be a
5.
okay. It's possible. So the question is, can you send back a file? Yeah, it's possible. So in that case, so first you have to set the type of the response. In this case, we didn't because by default it's text, so we will treat it as text. And then you can set the type and then say send and point it to a file, send back. Yeah. Oops. Why it doesn't? Okay, I'll have to zoom back out again so we can. Okay, so this is, I mean, very simple, not that different from the Node.js. Okay, so, and just in case you forgot, this is actually what we did last week. We doing exactly the same thing, but using only Node.js, not using Express. So, and a slightly few more lines of code if you compare. So this is really only 4 lines of code, really, and this is slightly more. But you can also actually see the format or the way it works is actually very similar, and partly because and Express is actually built on top of HTTP. So for example, the part of sending and receiving requests is actually using the same module underneath. Okay. So later on, when your Express server get more complicated, you might want to set up subfolders underneath it. So just as you say, when you build a website, if it gets too complicated, you might have a subfolder for all, say, the pictures or separate folders for CSS, etc. And so you could have node modules, and that's created by npm by default. And you can have separate folder for different routes or connections to databases or the public things you want to basically as part of web page. Okay, but we probably don't have to worry about that too much at the moment. So this is just again, so what will be included as a part of the server file. So you have to require the dependency, require express, and you do configuring settings, for example, set the port, which we didn't do. You can connect to database, for example, MongoDB, which we're going to do next week. Again, so the main work will be define the middleware and the routes and before starting the server. So we're going to have a look at the defining middleware and the routes now. Okay. So I'm going to skip this part fairly quickly. So this is how you require. We've seen this a few times already. But just remember to run this part and let app equal to express. So that creates an instance of Express that you can use. So you can't just use Express here directly. Okay, and do some settings. Again, you could say set app name to express examples or some other things you can do there, but these are optional. For example, you can set port to either 300 or the values of this environment. So if you remember, process is one of the built-in modules come from Node, and you can say environment and .port. If there's any value there, they'll be returned. Okay. So now we're going to talk about middleware. We're not going to see any concrete examples yet, but there's two things you need to remember. To use a middleware or define one, you say app.use followed by the middleware. Okay. So something you might require before, for example, if you require the body parser package already at the beginning of the declaration of the dependency, then you can use it there. And the other thing you need to remember is the middleware is nothing than say you have a request and you have a response and have a next. So the request and response is the same we've seen before. So the request will be the input you receive to the middleware. The response will be what you generate from the middleware. The next is the next defines what needs to be run next. Excuse me. And the usefulness of the reason we have a next that allows you to chain several middleware together. It says, okay, middleware 1, I did the request response, and my next will be middleware 2. So it will get to run the next one. Middleware will run middleware 2 when it's complete. And the middleware 2 can chain that to middleware 3 and 4 and 5 and go so. And you can also add conditions, say, okay, depends on the values, I will run next as middleware 3 instead of 4, depends on certain conditions. But these are 3 main important things, that's all. Okay, and the next thing is called routes. And essentially, for example, if you want to do any interaction with the database, and you have to define routes for each different interactions. So in the one route for, say, even for retrieving data, one route for, say, posting data, one for deleting data, and even for retrieve, you might have multiple routes. For example, one route to retrieve everything, and one route to retrieve data from a specific, one route to retrieve user from the user collection, and one route to retrieve product information from product collection. So you might have lots of these. And this is also called an endpoint. Okay, and we already seen one simple example before. We had app.o. If you remember from the previous example, just maybe you can look at the code, it'll be faster. So this is one of the routes. You can see, and you say app, and then dot followed by the type of request you want, followed by the path that matches your route. So basically, only if you match the path, then this route will be run. And in this case, we're using a star that basically means anything. And then finally, the things you will do inside this route. In this case, it will send back this text message. So more generic forms will be, say, app dot, here is a verb. So the verb can be O, which we've seen before, could be get. So that's only response to get request. And it could be post, put, and patch, delete, and maybe something else as well. And then form a pattern, a URL, which is the pattern that will match. For example, in this case, we use star, which says everything. You might say /user /something. That means only those ones which are related to user. And you can have more than one functions afterwards. You can have function 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So again, in this most simple one, we only has one function which sends back a text message. Okay, and this function here, these fn1, or more concretely, this example here, are called handler functions. So it's very similar to when you do the front-end development, you have handler functions, for example, for a button click. So that means what happens when the button clicks. So it's the same. So this is when route matches the pattern, what will happen. Okay, and the only thing to mention here is these handlers sometimes also called callback functions. And in the sense, they only happens when the route is activated or called. Say, in this example, so we only have one route, and it's run all the time because the pass says anything, it will do that. But sometimes, depends on the condition, they not run all the time, and that will be called only when, the pass matches. Okay, yeah, so that's the same examples we already seen so far. Here it says for all the requests and for any pass, what I'm gonna do is send the response this way. And for example, for the lab task this week, for example, and instead of sending a message, say welcome, and you can sending back a text string, which essentially is a JSON array or JSON object in this case. Okay, and this is where you can actually get some parameters. So as we said, and for most of these routers, you have two parameters. One is called request, the other one is response. And inside the request, you had all the information come in from the request. For example, it could be in some format like this. If you look at this URL, say localhost and user 34 and books and 8989, for example. Okay, it will only work if you define it like this in your route definition. So you say the path will be user and followed by user ID, and this user ID, it's a parameter because it has this column in front. So what it really expects is it expects you to have /user literally in your request. That's why you have this /user here literally. And then here, it's not expecting you to have comma user ID. Instead, expecting you to replace with some values. So that's why it will have 34 here. And then similarly, it would be literally the /books and followed by some values, which is the book ID. And the request object in your function, and it will have an object itself called the parameters, and would have these values stored inside them if the URL is like this. So all these are done automatically. So you could say, in your code, you can say request.parameter.userid, and it will give you 34, and you don't really have to do anything else. Okay. So in these examples, we now doing say app.get. So for any get request, and if the path matches this pattern, which is the same pattern as before, the return function will be just send request.parameters. So that's what this one is. So basically, it will send all the parameters and values it can get from the request back to the user. So we can know it's working properly. Okay, and we can do more complicated ones. So if when you define your path in the route, which is this one, this part here. And you can say the path will be /flight, from dash, to. So essentially now we have two expected variables that I want to get. One is from, the other one is to, and there should be a dash in between. So if you get this URL, and from the client side, and it will say, okay, it knows the array X will stand for the from part or the from property, and SFO will be the value for the to. So that's why you get the parameter object like this. Yeah. Okay. Okay, and so this is example, and to use the next bit. So we already see, for example, to get this one working, you have to send a get request, and you have to send the path as /example/b. We're going to see that in a second. And its response or its callback function has now have these three, and has the next, and which will run here. What it does, all it does is really just call the next function in the return handler. So basically, this get has two handler functions, this one and this one. And if you don't call this next at the end of the first function, nothing will happen. So basically, you will have a console log and the response will finish, nothing more. But if you call the next, this function will run as well. And in this case, it will send a message back to the client, say, hello, B. So basically, if you don't run this one, you will not receive any response. This one, you only have a console log, which is on the server side, which the user does not, the client does not see. And yes, okay. And we're going to see this one later on. But this is a more concise way to say, for the same path, which is book, and for the different type of request, what do you do? So you can define this separately. You say app route book, and you say app.get /book, and what are the functions are app.post and /book, what are the functions are. And this way you can put everything, say for the same route or same path book, for the get function you do this, for the post function you do this, and for the put function you do this. So just a slightly simpler way to do this route when you need to for the same path has different type of requests. Okay, and so this is examples of everything together we have seen so far. We request the express, okay, and then we put this one there. It says if the path is /, which means nothing afterwards, just the root path, and you send this message. And if the user types in something like /user /books /book ID, and it will return actually what you put in here. And if you type in example /b, and it will try to run here, which will say hello from me. And finally, we run the Express server. Okay, so I'm already created this file here. So as you can see, maybe I want to terminate this one first. So that's exactly the same as we see in the lecture slides. And we request the first, and for the get request, the root path is just this. And for different passes, we'll give you different responses. But if you type any random other passes, there's no route to handle them, so that's what happened. So if we do this, okay. So now we're starting to server, And this file is now called different. It's called server.js. So I just type in node and server.js. And so it says open at localhost 3000. That's because basically what this line says here. Okay, now if I go to my browser, which is here, I have to, okay. Maybe I'll try a different browser so I don't mess up with the zooming. Localhost. Okay, and it's pretty small, but if I type in localhost 3000 in Safari, and it shows welcome to my first express.js server. And if you look at the code, that's this line here, line number 5. So basically, if the path is just this, it will match here, and it will do this part. Okay. So next thing we can try is we can try to do something like this. And so if in the past we typed in /user followed by something, and then /books followed by something, I should see some response back. So now I say /user, is that user or users? No, users, / something, and then books, / okay, so my apologies, I mean, really small, you probably can't see. Let me see if any way I can make it. No, it's only zooming the bottom part, it does not zoom the top part. But you can see, it will pass that URL, which is send this back, okay, that's what I typed in the URL, it sends back to you. So that basically means this one understand the request and send back the parameters, which says it recognize these two properties and those are the values you typed in. And in the actual code, you probably will use that information to do something. For example, you go to the database, try to return the user ID, the user with that value and book ID with that from the database. Okay, and the last one we can try is /example/b. Okay, and for example, and now I'm just typing only /example, that's a pass, and which there's nothing from the server side, and if you type, it will get you, no, cannot get this one because there's no response designed there, but if you type /b, and you'll get this. So that's the pass, it matches. Okay, that's all we're going to talk about in terms of the Express server. And so in terms of reading, those are the two. So the practical Node.js, that's the chapter, and the express.js, the guide. Okay, but we are not quite done yet. We still have another part to talk about. Okay, the second part is about asynchronous JavaScript. Oops. And does anyone still remember? We mentioned this briefly last week. What is asynchronous? Yes, okay, yeah. So basically, asynchronous means the order of the code does not execute in the order they appear in the source file. So something below might get executed first. So first, just explain very quickly. And if we don't have this asynchronous, So if everything runs synchronous, and you might have this block code, which is part of the code block everything else from running, and from the user point of view, say the code is just like freeze. So what we have here is a very simple and event handler for button click. So on the page you have a button, and you say when it's clicked, what it does do is mostly this part here, which is gonna block everything else. So you're doing a for loop and a million times and doing some very simple things inside it. So when this is running, everything else have to wait it so that the PSP be blocking. Do I have the example here? Okay, yeah. We have this example, and if we run it, again. So that's the examples. If you remember, if we click this button, it will wait for a loop run a million times and before display this line of text. So basically, you can imagine if something takes longer time, it will be much less and pleasant. And it's a bad of user experience. So that's something we want to avoid. Okay. And again, and this is where the asynchronous JavaScript comes in. So basically, it will not run until the previous one steps finished. So, and this is an example where you have to run with a asynchronous JavaScript. Otherwise, it will give you an error. So what is happening is this line, and it tried to load a picture. And the second one, and is try to do something with the picture that's loaded. But the loading of the picture itself could take some time. So if we just run like this one will give you an error saying, for example, the response is not ready or it's empty, something like that. So instead, you have to using this callback function. So very similar to the callback we mentioned in the router, we have the callback for different passes. Okay, and so the add event listener itself, and which is essentially a type of callback, and because all these functions does not run until the click event is happened, and then you can do similar callbacks. For example, you put this line of code in the callback, so they are not run until this is finished. The first line is finished. Okay, and now is a long example where the callback are often used. And in this case, it is retrieving data from the server and is still using the XML HTTP request. Just for example, but in your coursework, you should all using fetch. We're going to see the examples very soon. Okay, and so here, if you look at the code, so the callback is happening here. It says the XHR, which is the XML HTTP request, and .unload, that means when this event happens, that means you finish loading, and you do this function, and you say callback XHR.response, and then later on, let me see, where is this response defined? Response type equals okay, yeah, sorry. So basically itself is a function and it's called load asset. Oops. and it will have the callback function, and this says when the XHR finishes the loading, it's going to run the callback function with the response as the input or the parameter for that function. And then later on, you can see we actually run this load asset function, which is here, and it's used coffee.jpg. That will be the URL to load the file, and the type is blob, and the actual callback function is called display image, and which is defined here. So that basically that means the display image function will only be run after the XHR finishes, and also it will take the parameter, which is the response from the XHR, as input. So basically this will display the image. And then we add the paragraph after this, so which says, okay, this is adding a paragraph to the page. But because this line will be waiting for the loading of the file finished before it runs the callback, so this paragraph actually is going to be added before the pictures appears. Okay, so if you look at the code, callback, async, yeah. So if I just run this file, okay, so again, a bit small. So I guess the important thing is in the code, we have the load asset first, but because the asynchronous nature, this adding paragraph part is get added before the picture actually being added to the page. So if I do the same again, and I'll just refresh the page, and you can see the paragraph appear first and then the picture, because it takes a little bit of time for the picture to finish loading and get added onto the page. Okay, and so the question is, okay, and if you want to have the paragraph always after the picture, what do you do?
Use promises.
Sorry?
Use promises.
Use promises. Yes. But in a sense, essentially, you just move this line of code into the callback. So basically, if you put this one inside the callback function, which will be here, and then it will be only run after the picture is added, and then do this, add this paragraph. Yeah. So in the using promise is the same thing. So for example, you can say only after the callback is finished, and then I use a promise to run these code. Yeah. Okay, that's basically explaining. Okay, and then so if you use a fetch, you can do the same thing, but this time it will give you a promise. Then you just use .then instead of using the unload. Okay, there's a slightly, a little bit more subtle difference between how you write the .then. So in this case, you say I want to fetch this URL could be fetch a picture and .then, and inside this will be the callback function, and you can say response.text. So only when this finished, you do another callback, which another promise then. But you can also do this explicitly. You say fetch this .then, you return this, and say, instead of say text dot then, you say dot then here. So that's basically when this finishes and you chain it with another then, and you can chain another then, actually keeps going on. So the benefit of doing, so basically this part does exactly the same job as this part, but sometimes this way is easier to read because all the dot then will be on the same level, whereas previously each then will go one level inside a previous one. So this is one level inside this, and if this one is for more, say, promise, will be dot then will be further inside this, less easier to read. Okay, you can have a catch block at the end, which is this, which says in case of any error. It's a good practice to have, but not required here. Yeah. So basically, promise does something very similar to callback, but they say usually promise is easier to manage and easier to read. That's all. And avoid this problem called pyramids of doom, or known as callback hell. So basically, just means you have a callback, inside it has another callback, inside have another callback, and it could go on many levels, making it very hard to write or understand the code. And whereas you use promise, and that's much easier to do this. Okay, yeah, so that's it for today.